The sound of boots crunching gravel shattered the pre-dawn silence, and Josephine Edwards jerked awake in her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as memories of the previous weeks flooded back debts, threats. Her father's grave barely settled under Nevada soil, but then she heard the gentle lowing of cattle being fed, and realized someone was doing her morning chores. She pushed herself up on one elbow, squinting through the darkness of her bedroom toward the window where the faintest hint of gray touched the eastern sky. Nevada City, California stretched out below her small ranch in shadowed silence, the town still sleeping while she usually dragged herself from bed to face another impossible day. But those sounds continued. The creak of the barn door, the splash of water into troughs, the soft murmur of a man's voice soothing her horses. Josephine threw back her worn quilt and padded barefoot across the cold wooden floor, pressing her face against the glass. In the dim light, she could make out a tall figure moving between the barn and the well with practiced efficiency, his hat pulled low, his shoulders broad beneath a dark shirt. Her pulse quickened for a different reason now. She had no hired hands. She could afford no help. Her father had died 3 months ago in October of 1867, leaving her with this failing ranch, mounting debts, and the kind of loneliness that ate at a person's bones. She grabbed her robe and rushed downstairs, not bothering with shoes as she pushed through the back door into the chill November morning. Her breath misted in front of her face as she hurried across the yard toward the barn, where lamplight now spilled from the open doorway. "Hello," she called out, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Who is there?" The figure emerged from the barn, and even in the weak light, she recognized him immediately. Yates Jackson had ridden into town 6 weeks ago, a drifter looking for work, and her father had hired him for a few days before he passed. Yates had stayed for the funeral, hat in hand, saying quiet words she barely remembered through her grief. Then he had disappeared, and she had assumed he had moved on like most ranch hands did. "Miss Edwards," he said, pulling his hat from his head. His voice was deep and measured, with an accent she could not quite place, somewhere from the South, maybe Texas. "I did not mean to startle you." "What are you doing here?" She wrapped her robe tighter around herself, suddenly aware of her disheveled state, her long dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. "Your chores," he said simply. "I finished feeding the cattle and horses. The chickens are next, and then I will milk the cow if you like." "I cannot pay you," she blurted out. "I can barely feed myself, and there are debts my father left, and I did not ask for payment." He turned back toward the barn, settling his hat on his head. "Go back inside, Miss Edwards. It is cold, and you are not dressed for it." She stood frozen for a moment, watching him disappear into the barn again. Part of her wanted to march after him and demand an explanation, but a larger part, the exhausted part that had been running on nothing but determination, and coffee, wanted to weep with gratitude. Instead, she turned and walked slowly back to the house, her mind spinning with questions. Inside, she lit the stove and put coffee on to boil, then dressed properly in a simple brown work dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. Through the kitchen window, she watched Yates move from building to building, his movements efficient and unhurried. By the time the sun crested the Sierra Nevada mountains to the east, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, he had completed every morning task that usually took her until noon. Josephine poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them outside. She found him washing his hands in the trough, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms tanned dark by years in the sun and marked with old scars. "Mr. Jackson," she said firmly, "you will at least take breakfast." He straightened, water dripping from his hands, and studied her face for a long moment. His eyes were gray, she noticed, like storm clouds before rain. "That is kind of you, Miss Edwards." They sat at her small kitchen table, and she served him eggs and bread, the last of what she had in the house until she could make the trip to town. He ate without speaking, and she found herself stealing glances at him between sips of coffee. He was perhaps 27 or 28 years old, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. There was something weathered about him, something that spoke of hard years and harder miles. "Why?" she finally asked, unable to hold the question any longer. He set down his fork and met her gaze. "Your father was good to me, treated me like a man, not a drifter. In my experience, that is rare." "He was a good man," she said softly, feeling the familiar ache of loss. "He was worried about you," Yates continued, "before he died. He talked about you constantly, how you were too stubborn to leave this place, too proud to ask for help, too determined to admit when you were drowning." Tears pricked at her eyes. "He said all that. He loved you," Yates said simply. "And he knew you would need help, even if you would not accept it. So you came back. It was not a question. I came back." He stood, carrying his plate to the wash basin. "I will be here every morning before sunrise. You do not have to pay me and you do not have to thank me. But you do need to let me help." Josephine rose to her feet, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Pride warred with desperation, and for once, desperation won. "All right," she whispered. "All right." Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Josephine would wake to find Yates already working, moving through the dawn like a ghost. She learned not to rise so early, allowing herself the luxury of sleep she had been denying herself since her father's death. When she did emerge, coffee brewing and breakfast cooking, he would join her at the kitchen table, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk. She learned that Yates had been born in Tennessee in 1839, making him 28 years old, just 3 years older than her own 25. He had fought in the war, though he did not speak of it except in the vaguest terms. Afterward, he had drifted west, working cattle ranches and farms, never staying long in one place. "Why not?" she asked one morning as frost covered the ground outside and their breath misted in the warm kitchen. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, studying the dark liquid. "I suppose I was looking for something, or running from something, maybe both." "Did you find it?" she asked quietly. He looked up at her then, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "I might have." The days grew shorter as November gave way to December. Josephine found herself looking forward to their morning conversations with an intensity that surprised her. Yates was not much of a talker, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and genuine. He had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, making her laugh when she thought she had forgotten how. She also discovered he was an exceptional ranch hand. The work that had been overwhelming her was somehow manageable now. Fences got mended, equipment repaired, animals tended with a level of care she could not have managed alone. With the pressure eased, she could focus on the other aspects of keeping the ranch running, managing what little money she had, planning for the spring, dealing with her father's creditors. It was the creditors that brought Thomas Marsh to her door on a cold Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Yates had returned. She was in the barn organizing tack when she heard horses in the yard. Through the gap in the door, she saw Marsh dismounting, along with 2 of his hired men. Her stomach clenched. Thomas Marsh was a wealthy rancher who owned most of the land surrounding Nevada City. He was in his mid-40s, with graying hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruel set of his mouth. He had been pressuring her father to sell for years, and since her father's death, he had made it clear he expected Josephine to accept his offer. She stepped out of the barn, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Marsh, Miss Edwards." He touched the brim of his hat, a mockery of politeness. "I've come to discuss your father's debts." "I am aware of the debts," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I am working to settle them." "Working?" He glanced around the yard with exaggerated concern. "I see no evidence of work. This place is falling apart, and you are a single woman trying to run a ranch alone. It is not proper and it is not sustainable. I am managing. You are drowning." He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of tobacco and whiskey. "I am prepared to make you a generous offer. I will buy this land for 3 times what your father owed. You can move into town, live comfortably. Maybe find a husband who can provide for you properly." The condescension in his voice made her jaw clench. "This ranch is not for sale." Marsh's expression hardened. "Your father's debts come due at the end of January. If you cannot pay, the bank will seize this property and auction it. I will buy it then for a fraction of what I am offering now. You would be wise to accept." "And you would be wise to leave my property," said a voice from behind Josephine. She turned to find Yates emerging from the cattle barn, a pitchfork still in his hands. He set it aside carefully as he approached, but there was nothing casual about the way he moved. He walked like a man ready for trouble. Marsh's eyes narrowed. "And who might you be?" "Yates Jackson. I work here." "Work?" Marsh laughed. "Miss Edwards cannot afford to pay hired hands." "That is between Miss Edwards and myself," Yates said, coming to stand beside Josephine. Not in front of her, she noticed, but beside her. An equal stance. "This is none of your concern, Drifter." "Miss Edwards asked you to leave," Yates said, his voice still calm but with an edge like tempered steel. "I suggest you respect her wishes." The 2 hired men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their gun belts. Josephine felt her heart hammering, but Yates did not move, did not reach for the revolver she knew he wore. He simply stood there, steady as stone, his gray eyes fixed on Marsh. After a long, tense moment, Marsh stepped back toward his horse. "You have until the end of January, Miss Edwards. When you lose this place, do not say I did not try to help you." They rode away in a cloud of dust, and Josephine realized she was trembling. Yates turned to her, his expression concerned. "Are you all right?" "He is right," she said, hating how her voice shook. "I cannot pay those debts. I have been trying, but the ranch is not bringing in enough money and I have no savings left." "How much do you owe?" She told him the amount and watched his jaw tighten. It was a fortune to her, more than the ranch could earn in 2 years of good operation. "There has to be a way," he said. "I have looked at every option," she said, feeling tears threaten. "I have sold everything I can spare. I have been buying supplies on credit I cannot repay. I am out of choices." Yates was quiet for a moment, then said, "What about the cattle? What about them?" "You have about 50 head from what I have counted. They are healthy, good stock. If we drove them to Sacramento, we could sell them for enough to make a significant payment on the debt." "Sacramento is over 100 miles away," she said. "And it is December. Winter drives are dangerous." "It is dangerous," he agreed. "But it is possible. The weather has been mild, and if we move quickly, we could be there and back before the worst of winter sets in." She stared at him, hope and fear warring in her chest. "That would take weeks, and I cannot do it alone." "You will not be alone," he said simply. "I will take you." The way he said it, with such quiet certainty, made something warm unfurl in her chest. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me." He looked away toward the mountains in the distance. "Maybe I am tired of running. Maybe I want to fight for something for once." He turned back to her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Maybe I think this place is worth saving, and maybe I think you are worth helping." She felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Yates, I think about it," he said. "We would need to leave soon, within the week, if we are going to attempt it. But I believe it is your best chance." That night, Josephine lay awake long after dark, weighing her options. A cattle drive in winter was risky, possibly fatal if the weather turned. But staying here, watching her father's ranch slip away while Marsh circled like a vulture that felt like dying by inches. And then there was Yates. In the past 3 weeks, he had become essential to her life in ways that had nothing to do with ranch work. She looked forward to seeing him each morning, to the sound of his voice, to the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching. She had been alone for so long, drowning in responsibility and grief. He made her feel like she could breathe again. The next morning she found him in the barn before sunrise as always, mucking out stalls. "I have decided," she said without preamble. "We leave in 3 days." He looked up, and she saw relief flash across his face. "All right, we have work to do." The next 72 hours passed in a blur of preparation. They gathered supplies, repaired the wagon, checked and rechecked the cattle. Yates proved to have extensive experience with cattle drives, organizing everything with military precision. Josephine rode into town to inform the few people who needed to know, including the bank manager, who looked skeptical when she explained her plan. "A winter drive to Sacramento," he said, shaking his head. "That is a considerable gamble, Miss Edwards." "It is my only option," she replied firmly. She also stopped at the general store to buy supplies on credit, hoping desperately that she would be able to repay it. The owner, a kind older woman named Mrs. Chen, packed extra blankets and food without comment, patting Josephine's hand. "Your father was a good man," Mrs. Chen said. "You are a good woman. This town needs more like you. I hope you make it." On the morning of departure, they set out before dawn. Yates rode point on his sorrel gelding, a horse named Copper that he had brought with him. Josephine rode her father's mare, Daisy, bringing up the rear while keeping an eye on their 2 pack mules. The cattle, used to being moved between pastures, followed with relative ease once they got moving. The first day was bitterly cold but clear. They followed the road southwest out of Nevada City, driving the cattle along the established route toward Sacramento. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh way, pine-covered mountains giving way to rolling foothills, the air so crisp it hurt to breathe. They stopped at midday to rest the cattle and eat a cold lunch. Yates had barely spoken all morning, his attention focused on the drive, but now he rode back to check on Josephine. "How are you holding up?" "I am managing," she said, though her legs ached from hours in the saddle and her hands were numb with cold. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a pair of thick gloves. "Here, your father's gloves will not keep you warm enough." She took them, touched by the gesture. "Thank you." That night, they made camp in a small clearing off the road. While Josephine cooked beans and coffee over the fire, Yates checked the cattle and set up their sleeping arrangements. He had brought 2 bedrolls and a canvas tarp that he rigged between trees to provide some shelter from the wind. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Above, stars blazed across the sky, more than Josephine had ever seen from the ranch. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "It is," Yates agreed, but when she glanced over, he was looking at her, not the sky. She felt her cheeks warm and looked back at the fire. "Tell me about Tennessee." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "It was green, so green you could not imagine anything else. Rivers and hills and forests that went on forever. My family had a small farm. We were not wealthy, but we had enough." "What happened?" "The war." His voice went flat. "I joined up in 1861. I was 22 and stupid enough to think I was fighting for something noble. By the time it ended, my parents were dead, the farm was burned, and I had seen things no man should see." She wanted to reach out to touch his hand, but did not dare. "I am sorry." "We all lost something," he said. "At least I survived. That is more than a lot of men can say." Is that why you keep moving? Because you cannot go home. There is no home to go back to. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a shower of sparks. Or there was not, anyway. The implication in those words hung in the cold air between them. Josephine's heart beat faster. "Yates, we should get some sleep," he said, standing abruptly. "Dawn comes early." He moved to his bedroll on the far side of the fire, and Josephine settled into hers, pulling the blankets tight around herself. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was a long time coming. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of the night and the steady breathing of the man across the fire, wondering what it meant that he had come back, that he was here beside her on this impossible journey. The next 4 days followed a similar pattern. They rose before dawn, drove the cattle until dark, made camp and ate together by firelight. The weather held, cold but clear, and they made good progress. Josephine found herself settling into the rhythm of the drive, her body adjusting to the long hours in the saddle. She also found herself falling for Yates Jackson, though she tried desperately to deny it. It was in the small things, the way he always served her coffee before taking his own, the way he positioned himself between her and any potential danger, the way his face softened when he looked at her. And it was in the bigger things, too, the quiet strength he projected, the kindness beneath his weathered exterior, the sense that when he made a promise, he kept it. On the 5th night, the weather turned. They woke to find heavy clouds rolling in from the west, and by mid-morning, rain began to fall. Cold, driving rain that soaked through their coats and turned the road to mud. The cattle grew restless, harder to control, and Josephine had to work twice as hard to keep them moving. By nightfall, they were all exhausted and soaked to the bone. Yates found a small abandoned barn just off the road, and they drove the cattle into a nearby field before taking shelter themselves. Inside the barn, Josephine stood shivering while Yates built a fire in an old iron stove someone had left behind. It took several attempts with damp kindling, but finally, flames caught and began to spread warmth through the drafty space. "Get out of those wet clothes," Yates said, not looking at her. "You will catch your death." "I do not have anything dry to change into," she said through chattering teeth. He dug through his pack and pulled out a spare shirt. "It will be too big, but it is dry. I will turn around." She changed quickly, grateful for his modesty and the warmth of the dry fabric against her skin. The shirt hung to her knees like a dress, and she had to roll the sleeves several times. When she told him he could turn around, she caught an expression on his face she had never seen before, something vulnerable and raw that disappeared as soon as he noticed her watching. They hung their wet clothes near the stove and ate a cold supper, too tired to cook anything more substantial. The rain hammered against the barn roof, and wind whistled through gaps in the walls. Despite the fire, Josephine could not stop shivering. "Come here," Yates said finally, opening one side of his coat. She hesitated only a moment before moving closer. He wrapped his coat around both of them, and she felt his warmth seeping into her cold body. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just listening to the rain and the crackle of the fire. "Josephine," he said softly, and she realized it was the first time he had used her given name. "If we do not make it, we will make it," she interrupted firmly. "But if we do not," he continued, "I want you to know that these weeks have been the best of my life. I have spent years wandering, feeling like I did not belong anywhere. But here, with you, I feel like I finally found where I am supposed to be." She pulled back just enough to look up at his face. In the firelight, his features were softer, the hard lines worn by years of struggle eased. "Yates, he kissed her. Gently at first, tentatively, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But she did not pull away. She pressed closer, her hands finding his chest, feeling his heart beating as fast as her own. The kiss deepened, and she felt like she was falling, but for once she was not afraid. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I am sorry. I should not have. Do not apologize," she said fiercely. "Do not you dare apologize for that." "I have nothing to offer you," he said. "I am a drifter with no home, no prospects. You have yourself," she said, cupping his face in her hands. "And that is enough. More than enough." They kissed again, slower this time, savoring it. When exhaustion finally pulled them towards sleep, they lay down together in his bedroll, her head on his chest, his arms wrapped around her. For the first time since her father died, Josephine felt safe. The rain continued through the night and into the next day. They spent the time resting the cattle and themselves, talking by the fire about everything and nothing. Yates told her about his childhood before the war, about fishing in the creek with his brother and his mother's apple pie. Josephine told him about her father, about growing up on the ranch, about her mother who had died when she was 10. He never remarried, she said. "I think he loved her too much to consider it." "I understand that," Yates said quietly. "Some people are meant to love only once." She looked up at him. "Is that what you believe?" "I used to," he said. "But I am starting to think that maybe some of us get a second chance if we are lucky enough to recognize it." The rain stopped on the morning of the 7th day, and they set out again under clearing skies. The roads were muddy and difficult, slowing their progress, but the worst seemed to be over. They were, by Yates's estimation, about 30 miles from Sacramento. They made good time over the next 2 days, the cattle cooperative and the weather holding. On the afternoon of the 9th day, they crested a hill and saw the city spread out before them in the valley below. Sacramento in 1867 was a bustling city of perhaps 15,000 people, the state capital and a major trading hub. Josephine felt a surge of hope and relief. They had made it. Finding a buyer for the cattle proved easier than expected. Yates knew a stockyard owner from his years of ranch work, and the man agreed to look at their herd. After some inspection and negotiation, he made an offer that was fair, perhaps even generous. Josephine accepted, and they spent the next day finalizing the sale and arranging for the money to be held in Sacramento for safekeeping, until they could return to Nevada City. When everything was settled, Josephine found herself standing in the middle of the bustling city with more money than she had ever possessed, hardly able to believe their good fortune. "We did it," she said, turning to Yates with a brilliant smile. "We actually did it." He smiled back, and the expression transformed his face. "You did it. I just helped." "No," she said firmly. "We did this together." They stayed in Sacramento for 2 nights, resting before the return journey. Yates insisted on getting them separate rooms at a modest hotel, propriety winning out over their growing closeness. But they spent the evenings together, walking the streets and talking, acting like any other courting couple. On their second evening, Yates took her to a small restaurant for a proper dinner. It was nothing fancy, but after days of trail food, it felt like a feast. Over coffee and pie, Josephine worked up the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her mind. "When we get back," she said carefully, "what happens then?" Yates set down his cup. "What do you want to happen?" "I want you to stay," she said, her heart pounding. "Not just to help with the ranch, but because you want to be there, because you want to be with me." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Josephine, I have been in love with you since the day I met you. I came back to your ranch because I could not stand the thought of you struggling alone. I have stayed because being near you is the closest I have ever come to feeling whole. If you will have me, I will spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of your faith." Tears pricked at her eyes. You do not have to prove anything to me, you already have. Then yes, he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I will stay, for as long as you want me. Forever. She asked, half joking, half hopeful. Forever sounds about right, he said seriously. They left Sacramento at dawn on the 11th day, their spirits high despite the long journey ahead. Without the cattle to slow them down, they made much better time, pushing their horses hard but not recklessly. The weather remained cold but clear, perfect for traveling. On the third day of the return journey, they encountered trouble. They were riding through a narrow pass when 3 men stepped out onto the road ahead, guns drawn. Josephine's blood ran cold. Bandits were common enough on these back roads, preying on travelers they thought might have money. That is far enough, the leader said. He was a big man with a scar across his cheek. Step down from those horses and hand over your valuables. Yates's hand moved slowly toward his revolver. We do not want trouble. Then you should not have been traveling with a woman and all that nice gear, the bandit said. Now I said get down. Yates, Josephine whispered urgently. Do as he says, Yates said quietly. Slowly. They dismounted and Josephine's mind raced. The money from the cattle sale was in a bank draft hidden in her saddlebag. If these men found it, everything they had worked for would be lost. The leader gestured with his gun. You there, cowboy, toss over that gun belt. Nice and easy. Yates unbuckled his belt and tossed it to the ground. The bandits relaxed slightly, thinking the danger had passed, and that was their mistake. Yates moved faster than Josephine had ever seen anyone move. He lunged forward, grabbing the leader's gun hand and twisting hard. The gun fired, the bullet going wild, and then they were grappling. One of the other bandits raised his weapon, but Josephine acted without thinking. She grabbed a rock from the ground and threw it as hard as she could, hitting him in the temple. He staggered, giving Yates time to wrench the leader's gun away and level it at all 3 men. Now, Yates said, his voice deadly calm despite being out of breath, you are going to walk away, fast, and if I ever see any of you again, I will not be nearly so polite. The bandits scrambled to their feet and ran, disappearing into the trees. Yates watched until they were out of sight, then lowered the gun. His hands were shaking. Are you hurt? Josephine asked, rushing to him. I am fine. Are you? He grabbed her shoulders, looking her over frantically. I am fine. That was incredible. You were incredible. He pulled her into a fierce embrace. Do not ever do that again. That rock throwing, you could have been shot. So could you, she pointed out, her voice muffled against his chest. I can handle myself. But if something happened to you, he broke off, holding her tighter. They stood like that for a long moment before finally breaking apart and remounting. They rode hard for the rest of the day, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the bandits. That night, camped under the stars, Yates was quiet and withdrawn. Josephine could see him struggling with something, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. What is wrong? She asked finally. Today, he said. When those men appeared, all I could think about was keeping you safe, but I also realized that being with me puts you in danger. I have lived a hard life, Josephine. I have enemies. There are men who might come looking for me. Do you have enemies among bandits? She asked. Not that I know of, but I have been in fights, in situations. Men remember. She moved closer, taking his hand. Yates, life is dangerous. My father died from a fever, not from anything violent, and it still took him from me. If I only let myself care about people who were perfectly safe, I would spend my life alone. I do not want that. I want you, danger and all. You deserve better. I deserve to make my own choices, she said firmly. And I choose you. Every day I choose you. He looked at her for a long moment, then pulled her close and kissed her deeply. I will spend every day trying to deserve that choice. They reached Nevada City on the evening of the 16th day since they had left. Josephine had never been so happy to see the small town and her ranch beyond it. They stopped first at the bank, where she deposited the bank draft and made arrangements to pay off her father's debts. The bank manager looked stunned. "Miss Edwards, I must say I did not believe you could pull this off. I am impressed." "I had excellent help," she said, glancing at Yates. News of their success spread quickly through the small town. By the next morning, several neighbors had stopped by to congratulate her and to meet the mysterious cowboy who had helped save the Edwards ranch. Through it all, Yates remained quietly beside her, deflecting praise and focusing on the work that needed to be done. Winter settled in properly over the next weeks. Yates moved into the small bunkhouse on the property, insisting it was proper since they were not married. But he spent most of his time in the main house, helping with repairs and planning for the spring. They fell into an easy domesticity that felt more right than anything Josephine had ever experienced. On Christmas Eve, they sat by the fire in her parlor, drinking coffee and talking about the future. Snow fell softly outside, blanketing the world in white. "I have been thinking," Yates said carefully, "about next year. We should get some breeding stock, expand the herd, and I think we could do better with the hay fields if we realign the irrigation." She asked softly. He looked at her, firelight dancing in his gray eyes. "If you will have me as more than a hired hand. Josephine, I love you. I want to build a life here with you. I want to wake up every morning knowing I am home. I do not have a ring, and I know this is not very romantic, but—" "Yes," she interrupted, launching herself into his arms. "Yes, yes, yes." He caught her, laughing, and then they were kissing, and the world narrowed to just the two of them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I will make you happy," he promised. "Every day for the rest of my life I will make you happy." "You already do," she said. They were married in January of 1868 in a simple ceremony in the small church in Nevada City. Mrs. Chen from the general store stood as witness, along with several neighbors who had become friends. Josephine wore a simple blue dress, and Yates wore his best shirt and a new vest she had bought him as a wedding gift. As they stood before the preacher and said their vows, Josephine thought about how much her life had changed in just a few short months. She had been drowning in grief and debt, alone and terrified. Now she stood beside a man who loved her, who had saved her ranch and her heart, who had proven through actions more than words that he would never leave her. "I pronounce you man and wife," the preacher said, and Yates kissed her to the applause of their small gathering of well-wishers. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful. Neighbors brought food and drink, and there was music and dancing in the church hall. Josephine danced with her husband, and felt like she might burst with happiness. As the evening wound down and they rode back to the ranch together in the wagon, Yates reached over and took her hand. "Thank you," he said. "For what? For giving me a home, for giving me a purpose. For loving me when I did not think I deserved to be loved. You gave me all those things too," she said. "We saved each other, Yates." He smiled and squeezed her hand. "I suppose we did." Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Running a ranch was hard work, even with two people, and there were setbacks. A fence broke during a spring storm, letting some cattle loose. Disease killed several chickens. The summer was dry, threatening their crops. But they faced every challenge together, and somehow that made all the difference. Yates proved to be an excellent manager, and his instincts about the breeding stock and irrigation paid off. By the fall of 1868, the ranch was not just surviving but beginning to thrive. Josephine discovered she was pregnant in October, a year and a day after her father had died. She told Yates one morning as he was preparing to ride out to check the cattle, and he went so still she thought something was wrong. "Yates," he turned to her, and she saw tears in his eyes. "A baby." "A baby," she confirmed, suddenly nervous. "I know we have not talked about it much, and if the timing is not—" He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around while laughing. "The timing is perfect. Everything is perfect. You are perfect." "Put me down," she said, laughing too. "You will make me dizzy." He set her down gently, his hands going to her still flat belly. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be parents." "Are you ready for that?" she asked. "I have no idea," he said honestly. "But I will figure it out. We will figure it out together." Their son was born in June of 1869, a healthy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him William after Josephine's father, though they called him Will. Yates held his son for the first time with hands that trembled, looking down at the tiny face with an expression of such profound love that Josephine felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "Hello, Will," Yates whispered. "I am your father, and I promise you I will never let anything hurt you. I will teach you to be strong and kind and honest. I will show you how to ride and work cattle and fix fences, and I will make sure you always know you are loved." Watching her husband with their son, Josephine thought about that cold November morning 2 years ago when she had heard footsteps in the dark and found Yates doing her chores. She had been so lost then, so alone. She never could have imagined the life they would build together. The years passed, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Will grew into a bright, energetic boy who followed his father everywhere. In the winter of 1871, they had a daughter they named Margaret, though everyone called her Maggie. She had Josephine's temperament, stubborn and fierce and loving all at once. The ranch continued to prosper. By 1873, they had expanded their land holdings, buying up adjacent parcels as they became available. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, and Josephine was able to start a small garden business, selling vegetables and preserves in town. Thomas Marsh, the rancher who had tried to force Josephine to sell, suffered a series of reversals. His own poor management led to mounting debts, and eventually he had to sell his land piece by piece. Josephine and Yates bought some of it, but they took no pleasure in his downfall. They had learned that success was sweeter when you earned it through hard work rather than through another's misfortune. On their 5th wedding anniversary in January of 1873, Yates woke Josephine before dawn. "What are you doing?" she mumbled sleepily. "I want to show you something," he said. "Get dressed. It is cold." She followed him outside where the world was silver with frost under a sky full of stars. He led her to the barn, and she realized he had already done all the morning chores. "Yates," she said, understanding flooding through her. "You did not have to, I wanted to," he said. "Do you remember the first time I did this? The first morning I came back? Of course I remember. I did it because I wanted to give you something you needed: rest, a little peace, a break from struggling alone. But also because I wanted to show you that someone cared, that you were not alone anymore." He took her hands. "I still want to give you those things. Every day, I want you to know that you are cherished and protected and loved beyond measure." She felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "I do know that. You show me every single day." "I hope so," he said. "Because you saved me, Josephine. I was a man without a home, without purpose, running from ghosts I could not escape. You gave me a reason to stop running. You gave me a life worth living." "We gave each other that," she said, echoing the words she had spoken on their wedding night. He smiled and kissed her gently. "Come on. I have coffee brewing and I want to watch the sunrise with my wife." They sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, drinking coffee as the sun slowly painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. Inside, their children still slept, warm and safe. Around them, the ranch hummed with the quiet life of animals and growing things. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, built from determination and hard work and love. As the sun finally crested the mountains, Yates turned to her. "Do you ever regret it, staying here fighting for this place?" "Never," Josephine said without hesitation. "This ranch is my father's legacy, but it is also ours. It is where I met you, where we fell in love, where we are raising our children. I would not trade it for anything in the world." "Neither would I," he said. The years continued to pass in a blur of work and joy. Will grew into a strong young man who shared his father's talent with horses and cattle. Maggie became a skilled rider who could outwork most of the hired hands. In 1875, they had another son they named James, and in 1878, a second daughter named Catherine. Josephine and Yates aged together, their faces weathering like the land they worked, their hands calloused from years of labor. But the love between them never faded. If anything, it deepened, becoming the bedrock on which their entire lives were built. In the spring of 1887, 20 years after they first met, Josephine stood on the porch of their house watching Yates work with Will and James in the corral. He was 52 now, his dark hair liberally streaked with gray, his body still strong but bearing the marks of hard years. Yet he moved with the same quiet competence he always had, teaching their sons the way he had once taught himself. Maggie came out to stand beside her mother, now a young woman of 16 with suitors already calling. "Papa is teaching them about that new bull we bought. He wants to make sure they know how to handle it safely," Josephine said. "He is a good father," Maggie observed. "I hope I marry someone half as good as him." Josephine smiled. "When you find someone who looks at you the way your father looks at me, then you will know you have found the right one." "How does he look at you?" "Like I am the only woman in the world, like I am worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth building a life beside." Maggie considered this. "Did you know right away that he was the one?" Josephine thought back to that cold November morning, to the sound of boots on gravel, and the sight of a familiar figure working in the pre-dawn darkness. "I think I knew the moment he came back. He had no reason to return except that he cared about me." Everything that came after the cattle drive, the wedding, all of this, that was just us proving to ourselves what we already knew in our hearts. That evening, after the children were in bed, Josephine and Yates sat on the porch as they had countless times before. The spring air was warm and sweet with the scent of wildflowers. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, noting her distant expression. "About how different my life might have been if you had not come back," she said. "I would have lost the ranch, probably ended up working as a seamstress or a cook in town. Not a bad life, but not this life." "You would have survived," he said. "You are the strongest person I have ever met. Maybe, but I would not have been happy, not like this." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for coming back, Yates, for choosing me, for staying." He kissed the top of her head. "Best decision I ever made." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one. In the distance, an owl hooted. Somewhere in the barn, a horse whinnied softly. These were the sounds of home, of the life they had built together from nothing but determination and love. The next years brought their own joys and sorrows. Will married a local girl named Sarah in 1889, and they gave Josephine and Yates their first grandchild the following year, a boy they named Yates Jr. Maggie married in 1891 to a young rancher from the next county over, a good man who reminded Josephine of her husband. James and Catherine grew into capable adults who chose to stay and help run the ranch. The property had grown to over 500 acres by then, one of the most successful operations in the region. But Josephine and Yates never forgot their humble beginnings, the desperate cattle drive in winter, the close calls and hard choices. In 1897, on a warm summer evening, Yates and Josephine celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, their grandchildren, and friends from all over the county. There was food and music and dancing, and at one point, Yates led Josephine out into the middle of the yard and held her close as they swayed to a slow song. 30 years, she marveled. It feels like both forever and no time at all. I have loved every minute, he said. Even the hard times because we faced them together. Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you had kept drifting? She asked. Sometimes, he admitted. I think I would have ended up alone somewhere, working some ranch for wages, just existing instead of living. Finding this, it was like waking up after years of sleepwalking. I feel the same way, she said softly. You brought me back to life when I thought I had lost everything worth living for. He tightened his arms around her. We saved each other, and then we built something beautiful. As the party wound down and their guests departed, Josephine and Yates found themselves alone on the porch once more. It had become their spot over the years, the place where they talked through problems and celebrated victories, and simply enjoyed each other's company. Josephine, Yates said, his voice serious, I need you to know something. What is it? If I could go back and live my life over, I would not change a single thing. Every hardship, every mistake, every dark moment, they all led me to you, and that makes all of it worthwhile. She felt tears prick at her eyes. I would not change anything either. You are my great love, Yates Jackson, my partner, my best friend, the father of my children. You are everything. They kissed as the stars wheeled overhead and the night sounds of the ranch wrapped around them like a blanket. 30 years of marriage, of working side by side, of building a life from nothing, and the love between them burned as bright as it had that first winter when they had driven cattle to Sacramento and discovered what it meant to fight for something together. The years continued their steady march. Josephine and Yates aged gracefully into their 60s and then 70s, their children taking over more of the ranch operations while they transitioned into advisory roles. They spent their days tending the garden, working with the horses, and spoiling their growing number of grandchildren. In the spring of 1907, 40 years after they first met, Josephine fell ill with pneumonia. Yates nursed her through it with the same dedication he had shown in everything, staying by her bedside day and night until she recovered. The scare reminded them both of their mortality, of the fact that their time together, though rich and full, was finite. We have been blessed, Josephine said one afternoon as she recovered, sitting in the sunshine with a blanket around her shoulders. We have, Yates agreed, sitting beside her and taking her hand. When I think about my father, about how worried he was leaving me alone, I wish I could tell him how it all worked out, that you came back, that you saved the ranch, that we built this beautiful life together. I think he knows, Yates said quietly. I think he is proud of you, of us. She squeezed his hand. I hope so. They lived on in comfortable companionship, their love a steady flame that warmed everyone around them. Their children and grandchildren would later tell stories about them, about the cattle drive in winter, about the morning chores done in darkness, about the way they looked at each other even after 50 years of marriage. In the winter of 1918, Yates passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79. Josephine was 76, and the loss devastated her. For 50 years, he had been her constant companion, her partner in every sense. The world without him felt dimmer, quieter, less vibrant. But she carried on, drawing strength from their children and grandchildren, from the ranch they had built together, from the memories of a lifetime of love. She lived for 2 more years, spending her days tending her garden and telling stories about the cowboy who had appeared at her barn before sunrise and changed her life forever. When Josephine passed away in the spring of 1920, she was buried beside Yates on a hill overlooking the ranch. Their children placed a simple stone marker that read, Yates Jackson and Josephine Edwards Jackson. They saved each other and built something beautiful. The ranch remained in the family for generations, passed down through their children and grandchildren. Each new generation heard the story of how it had almost been lost, how a cowboy returned to help a woman in need, how love had bloomed in the hardest of circumstances and sustained them through decades of hard work and joy. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the sun was just beginning to paint the sky, ranch hands swore they could see two figures on the porch, a man and a woman sitting close together, watching the sunrise and holding hands, their love transcending even death to remain part of the land they had poured their lives into. The legacy of Yates and Josephine Jackson lived on in more than just the land and buildings. It lived in the values they had instilled in their children, the importance of hard work, of keeping promises, of fighting for what mattered, of loving with your whole heart. It lived in the way their grandchildren approached their own marriages, looking for partners who would stand beside them through thick and thin. It lived in the countless small kindnesses that rippled out from that first morning when Yates had done Josephine's chores so she could sleep a little longer. Their great-grandson, William Jackson III, took over management of the ranch in the 1940s. By then, it had grown to over 1,000 acres, one of the premier cattle operations in Northern California. But William never forgot the stories his grandmother Maggie had told him about Yates and Josephine, about how close they had come to losing everything, about how love and determination had saved them. He kept the original homestead house maintained as a family museum of sorts, preserving the kitchen table where they had shared countless meals, the porch where they had watched sunrises together, the barn where Yates had done those first morning chores. Visitors who came to the ranch could see these artifacts of a great love story, and many left inspired by what two people had built together through sheer will and devotion. The story of Yates and Josephine became local legend, told and retold around campfires and dinner tables. It inspired other young couples facing hardship, reminded older couples of what had drawn them together in the first place. It became a testament to the power of showing up, of doing the work, of loving someone so completely that you would drive cattle through winter storms just to give them a chance. Some said the ranch was blessed, that the love between its founders had soaked into the very soil and made everything grow better. Maybe that was just romantic fancy, or maybe there was truth to it. Either way, the Jackson Ranch thrived through depression and drought, war and hardship, standing as a monument to what two people could accomplish when they worked together toward a common dream. In 1967, on the 100th anniversary of the year Yates and Josephine met, the family held a large celebration. Descendants came from all over the country, dozens of people who owed their existence to that cowboy, who had returned to help a struggling rancher, and the woman who had been brave enough to accept his help, and eventually his heart. They gathered on that same hill where Yates and Josephine were buried, looking out over the land that had been transformed from a failing homestead to a thriving ranch. Someone read from a journal Josephine had kept, entries that detailed both the mundane and the extraordinary moments of their life together. One entry, dated December 1867, read, "Today we drove the cattle through rain and mud, and I thought we might fail. But Yates was beside me, steady as stone, and I realized that with him I can face anything. He is not just helping me save my ranch. He is teaching me what it means to have a true partner, someone who sees your struggle and steps in without being asked, without expecting thanks, without keeping score. I think I am falling in love with him, and it terrifies me and thrills me in equal measure. Another entry from January 1868. We married today. I wore my blue dress, and Yates looked so handsome I could hardly breathe. When he said his vows, his voice was steady and sure, and I knew I was making the right choice. This man came back for me when he had no obligation to do so. He fought for me, for us, for this ranch. And now he is my husband, and I get to spend the rest of my life showing him what a gift that is. A final entry from 1915. Yates turned 76 today. We sat on the porch watching the sunset, as we have done 10,000 times before. His hand in mine is as familiar as my own heartbeat. He said something today that made me cry. He said that every morning he still feels grateful to have a home, a purpose, someone to love. After all these years, he is still that lost cowboy who found his way to my barn in the darkness. And I am still the struggling woman who heard footsteps and found salvation. We saved each other. We built this life together, and I would not trade a single day of it. As the sun set over the ranch on that centennial celebration, the Jackson family felt the presence of their ancestors in the warm breeze, in the familiar sounds of cattle and horses, in the solid ground beneath their feet. Yates and Josephine were gone, but their legacy lived on in every person gathered there, in every acre of land, in every sunrise watched from that old porch. Their love story had become immortal, passed down through generations, as a reminder of what really mattered in life. Not wealth or status or ease, but connection, partnership, the willingness to show up for someone else even when it is hard, especially when it is hard, the courage to accept help when you need it and to offer it when you can. The faith that love can transform everything: a failing ranch, a drifting life, a broken heart. And somewhere, perhaps, in whatever place the spirits of the departed go, Yates and Josephine Jackson were together still, watching over the land they had loved, the family they had created, the legacy they had built from nothing but hard work and unwavering devotion. They were together as they had always been meant to be, partners in this life and whatever came after, their love a light that would never fade. The ranch continued on through the decades, surviving challenges and celebrating triumphs, always guided by the principles its founders had established. Work hard, keep your word, fight for what matters, love with everything you have. And never forget that the smallest gesture, doing someone's chores so they can sleep a little longer, can change the course of a life, can spark a love that echoes through generations, can build something that lasts forever. This was the legacy of the cowboy and the rancher's daughter, of Yates Jackson and Josephine Edwards. This was their story, their gift to the future, their proof that love and determination can overcome any obstacle and build something beautiful that will endure long after we are gone.